Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. First of all, we would like to give big thanks to the US Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. And we would like to tell a lot about Stephen, especially since he is our amazing speaker, scientist, and artist, and also a great speaker and the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher. And we would like you to join us, stay active, ask your questions that we'll definitely address in the next time. And also, we would like you all to enjoy. And Stephen, thank you very much for joining us weekly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Aaliyah. As always, thank you very much for your participation, your ongoing participation, without which these talks would not be happening. I also want to thank the American Consulate, the U.S. Consulate in Almaty, everybody responsible, again, for facilitating this platform on a weekly basis, Elmira, Dana, the entire staff. And again, it's my pleasure and privilege to be able to provide philosophical perspectives where we're not operating from a position of belief or faith or opinion, but an incontrovertibility that philosophy uniquely owns, uniquely can embrace. So, and I think one of the themes that runs through all of these talks is how everything tends to relate to fundamental formulations, fundamental simplifications, no matter what the specific topic is. In fact, that's why it's possible to talk about so many different things, because philosophy at the highest level of generality connects them. Because philosophy, more than any other human enterprise, intellectual enterprise, relates to everything. I've shown you this before, this sort of mathematical logical formulation where a heuristic space is an identity space. Two things are equal for some purpose or other. An epistemic space, a philosophic space, a rigorous space is a space of absolute distinctiveness, non-identity, a non-symmetry space. There are many terms that one can use to help characterize these spaces. And the relationship between the two, which is a deep aspect of the nature of those spaces, is that the heuristic at its limit converges on the epistemic, and that actually relates to why relativity theory and quantum mechanics are so powerful within physics. It relates to how any individual entity, any individual object exists, and how and why it exists uniquely. These are ideas I've touched upon in some talks. I've developed them more than in others, but I will always be returning. And keep in mind, too, that clarity of understanding develops only over a long period of time. It did for me over a long period of time, because it's not just a matter of understanding some of those fundamental relations, but how they relate to everything else. When I first began investigating aspects of heuristic space and its governing functionality, convergence, I didn't know or didn't appreciate how it pertained to all aspects of our experience other than the purely limitingly rigorous, other than the philosophic. It was something that I came to realize over time. So again, don't think that everything has to be immediately clear. I talked about the aphorisms that I write. I find that in some instances, a given aphorism can communicate the essence of the philosophical results to a given individual almost like instantaneously, like a Zen koan. But I never know who might respond to what aphorism, and altogether there are over 20,000 of them. And if you'd like to have more broad access to those writings, those formulations, there's my website. I've given out the address before. It's the books, plural, books of Joshua, JOSHUA.com, and that has maybe half or 2/3 of my writing, several hundred different works. Okay, as many of these talks, they correlate with specific international days of recognition, celebration, commemoration. Tonight, because I'm in Los Angeles, it's night. Today's, where you are, is such a talk. On February 11th, we celebrated the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. It's something that I talked about at the very beginning of this series of talks, shortly after the pandemic began. But what I said then will be very different from what I'm going to be saying now. I never look back at previous talks. I always like to work from what immediately strikes me, occurs to me when formulating a thought. And then it develops from there, and it becomes unique in the way that all of those artworks that you see are individually unique because they start from something, a brushstroke that's different in every case from work to work. And so the subsequent development is different. Let me also make a couple of general comments about this topic. One of the things, well, if we're dealing with achievement, if we're dealing with like a woman becoming a celebrated, an honored, a contributory scientist, a mathematician, we're dealing with accomplishment. We're dealing with, and anytime we're dealing with accomplishment, with a goal, let's say, that may be realized, with something that's achieved, we're dealing with something that is playing itself out within heuristic space. We're dealing with an object. Now, not to say that human beings are objects, but within heuristic space, yes, they are. Everything is an object. And every object within heuristic space is the result of a convergence. Remember, the defining logic of epistemic rigorous space is, I said divergence, I meant convergence. The defining logic of epistemic space is divergence. Any two things are rigorously distinct. That's the point of that formulation. A is not equal to A. It's a non-identity space. In the case of a heuristic space, a convergent space, objects arise by convergent factors. Now, an existential point, I exist right here, right now, can be represented as a universal convergence. Everything in the world, in the universe, converging on this point right here, right now. That's true for every point, every object within a heuristic field. But if we're interested in achieving a goal, and that's what heuristics imply, that we're trying to accomplish something, get somewhere other than where we are, that's going to require a new set of convergent factors. And in the case of all of these women who achieved illustrious or noteworthy careers, there were factors at play, convergent factors that made their achievement possible. In all instances, there's some native ability, but as I've said on numerous occasions, we don't know in advance whether or not a given individual possesses native ability. It's the point of Sartre, the existentialist formulation, existence precedes essence. It's the lesson of Van Gogh that, again, I repeatedly go back to, that at 27, when Van Gogh began painting, began drawing, he demonstrated no talent for art. But he worked hard. He devoted himself at an intellectual level, at a technical level, and in the course of a decade emerged as, well, the artist now seen as the most popular great painter in history. Did Van Gogh always have that ability and it was just unlocked? These are metaphors. We can talk about it however we like. But the point is, in advance, we don't always know. In the case of all of these women, there were early indications. And those early indications were important because it opened up opportunities in various ways. And it makes the struggle in cultures that don't embrace traditionally women or women achieving in certain directions, it makes the struggle less of a burden, less something that is almost impossible to overcome. And it tends to recruit help along the way. And that becomes essential in any given case for the success that's achieved. Now, the other general point I want to make is we can't do controlled experiments in heuristic space, not rigorous experiments. And so for any given woman, man, anyone who accomplishes anything, we can't definitively say what the ingredients or what the decisive ingredients of that accomplishment are. Not rigorously, because we can't go back in time, modify some circumstances, and see whether we get the same result, and see what's decisive in achieving that result. So, all of these comments that I make about the biography of these people are, in a sense, heuristic comments. They can help us, they can inspire us, but they need not ever deter us because they're not rigorous. And I'll talk about that more at the end when I develop more of the philosophical implications of this talk. Another thing, I know this is kind of a longish introduction, but I want to kind of set out some of these parameters. We're dealing with, as I said, accomplishment. So we're dealing with heuristics. We're dealing with people that start in one place and end up somewhere else in terms of achievement or accomplishment. What's the value of investigating some of these examples, the examples of like famous female scientists or mathematicians? Well, epistemically, and again, I'll return to this at the end, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether a given, it doesn't matter epistemically whether there's ever been an illustrious female scientist or whether there's ever been an illustrious female mathematician, computer programmer, computer scientist. It doesn't matter because the past cannot guarantee the future, cannot limit the future. Because, again, of epistemic space, A is not equal to A. Any difference between anyone's circumstances and anything that has come before means that what has been seen as limiting in the past need not be limiting now, not rigorously so. Where others have failed, we can succeed because of any difference, distinction between past and present. So, but within heuristic space, we take inspiration, we categorize. It's a space of categorizations, of language, of social structures. We heuristically see that a woman is capable of achieving great results in computer science. And so that means if we are a woman, we may be able to achieve that simply because of that identity, right? Again, heuristic space is identity space, so we look for equivalences and we can find inspiration from them. But epistemically, we never need be deterred if something has not been achieved, has not been seen before. Okay, Now, I want to begin in ancient times. There's a connection, a deep connection I've talked about a lot of things at this point in the course of these talks, between science and philosophy. Science is not at the level of rigor of philosophies. Philosophy, as I've emphasized, is the limit of rigor, what's incontestable. A scientific theory is not incontestable. A scientific result is not incontestable. And although it may apply in past circumstances, it need not apply in any future circumstance. It need not apply to any different circumstance. And every circumstance is different in some way. It's the nature of our existential space. So we talk about belief in science. We do not talk about belief in philosophy. If you feel that you're believing a certain philosophical principle, what you're believing is not a philosophical principle. Philosophical principles rise above the provisionalness of belief. But because philosophy is operating at the highest level of rigor, the highest level of generality, it can drop down, and it can imagine situations that are a little bit less rigorous. And one of those situations that philosophy can imagine, can elaborate, is mathematics, where, again, A is not equal to A is the fundamental condition of an absolute rigor. A equals A is the fundamental condition of any mathematical space, any logical space. We can sort of move down in the case of science. Its controlled experiments, the comparisons that it's making are clearly not rigorous, right? We're comparing a drug given to a person here versus a placebo given to a person here for the same condition, but these two individuals are not in the same circumstances. One is to the left of the other. Our world is asymmetric, and that's going to be important in some of these examples I give. Our world is asymmetric, and that asymmetry means science is not rigorous. Controlled experiments are not possible. But, so, what's the connection between science and philosophy? Philosophy created science as a philosophical method. The original progenitors, the original formulators of the scientific method were philosophers, people like Francis Bacon. And in fact, scientists for centuries, from antiquity to even the time of Newton, were called natural philosophers. Newton considered himself a natural philosopher. He was philosophizing, but about certain specific aspects of nature. So the connection between science and philosophy is very close, but never forget, philosophy is rigorous, whereas science, even though it appears to be, not so. In the early 20th century, around the year 1900, 1902, something like that, Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist, and I'm talking about men, I'm going to be on women very soon. Niels Bohr published 3 papers on basically quantum theory, creating the quantum theory of the hydrogen atom, which led to the quantum mechanical revolution of 20th century physics. That and relativity theory are probably the 2 great achievements of the 20th century in terms not just of physics, maybe in general, those 2 accomplishments. Niels Bohr published those papers in a journal of philosophy. And that wasn't that long ago, a little over a century ago. So, and there's a physicist, a Nobel Prize-winning American physicist, Steven Weinberg, who once said, at the highest level, physics becomes philosophy. Einstein was doing the physics of existentialism. On Einstein's desk, at his death, it was completely covered with publications, papers, and it was a large desk. So there were dozens of papers, books, periodicals on this desk. There are photographs of it. I actually have shown it in the past. I don't have it right now. There's only one word you can read from one of the publications, and that word is philosophy. Einstein considered himself a physicist, philosopher. Without the philosophical component to his work, we would not have his work. So the connection is strong. Now, why do I emphasize the connection between philosophy and science, aside from the fact that these are philosophical talks? Because, again, as I've emphasized over and over again, the patron saint of philosophy, St. Catherine of Alexandria, happens to be a woman. So even though the tradition, the scientific tradition, even to modern times, has been dominated by men, by male scientists, male contributions, the progenitor of the tradition in terms of a kind of intellectual umbrella is an intellectual guiding spirit, is a woman who died at 17 or 18 or 19. Every time I look up in the literature, I get a different number. Obviously, we're talking about somebody who died in the early 4th century. So again, close to 2 millennia ago. But a woman celebrated for her learning, a woman who, because of the connection between philosophy and science throughout much of the history of the two, that scientists were natural philosophers, she was the guiding spirit of both. So a woman is placed central to the tradition. That's, I think, for any woman seeking inspiration, for whether or not science is a path that a woman can pursue, that decides the issue from one direction. There's another interesting, though, aspect of the St. Catherine legend. There was another woman, Hypatia, from the same city as St. Catherine. St. Catherine's full name is St. Catherine of Alexandria, Egypt, a city of great intellectual activity. It was also the city that St. Augustine was from or worked in. So it was a city that was renowned throughout the world at that point, as much as anything could be renowned about the world when communication was not what it is today, obviously. Saw St. Catherine of Alexandria, a woman highly regarded and feared, apparently, for her learning, and Hypatia, a mathematician, astronomer, philosopher. She was a Neoplatonic philosopher, somebody influenced by the work of Plato and its subsequent sort of development iterations. That work basically sees the world, the reality, as not quite the reality, that there's a truer reality beneath the appearances of things or behind the appearances of things. And it's the goal of philosophy to glean, intuit, reveal that ultimate reality. That's sort of the Neoplatonic tradition, in a few sentences. But Hypatia was especially renowned, especially important for her work in mathematics and astronomy. Now, when it comes to people that lived that long ago, a lot has been lost. We don't have a lot of her remaining work. A lot of her work does not exist. But apparently she wrote on conic sections. Conic sections, figures, geometric figures like circles, ellipses, hyperbolas, parabolas, were central to a lot of mathematical focus in ancient times. But she's especially renowned for having edited Ptolemy's Almagest. Ptolemy was the astronomer who developed to a form that became dominant throughout, well, antiquity and the Middle Ages, of a Earth-centered universe. It was the Ptolemaic universe that Copernicus was arguing against, and that Galileo was arguing against, and that the rejection of set the terms for the development of modern physics, modern mechanics, in the work of, well, Galileo and Newton. But the Almagest, Ptolemy's work, was the most influential, the most significant work in astronomy for a millennium and a half, 1,500 years. And Hypatia apparently was involved in editing it to achieve the form in which it assumed that influence. So one thing we're going to see as I go through some of these examples is these women that I'm going to be highlighting are not just examples of minor work that nevertheless establishes that a woman can do science or a woman can do mathematics. These are women, Hypatia is an example, involved in some of the most fundamental results in the history of science. So, and Hypatia seems to be the earliest mathematician that we know was a woman and that we have, some information about. She also, because of her role at the beginning of the mathematical, tradition, in terms of like our knowledge of female involvement, female contributions, has become an icon of feminism. She is a figure that people look to. Oh, I have some photographs. Let me share you. I have an image. Now, obviously, well, here's an image of St. Catherine, a different one that I've shown before, painting. We obviously don't know exactly what St. Catherine looked like, any more than we know what Jesus Christ looked like from that time. These are all artists' interpretations based upon what they think captures, the spirit, of the legend. Here is an etching of Hypatia. But again, the degree of correspondence, we can't even begin to guess. Okay, in more modern times, and these names that I'm selecting to discuss with you are people that I had known about. I didn't go online and look up, famous mathematicians that are women or famous scientists that are women. As I always do, relying upon my sort of experience of the subjects. I have looked up some additional details about these individuals, just to give you some more biographical sort of framing. But still, these are people that I had known about before this talk. Ada Lovelace is the next person I wanted to make some comments about. There's a computer language, Ada, that was developed for the United States Defense Department, also, I think, for the United Kingdom Defense Department. It is named after Ada Lovelace. Let me show you a picture of her. She lived in the early 19th century, Ada Lovelace. There are a number of things remarkable here. For one thing, she was the daughter of Lord Byron. Byron, the great English Romantic poet, actually the first true literary celebrity of modern times. People were as obsessed with Byron as in the 60s, people like around the world were obsessed with the Beatles. Okay? He was that much of a public idol. He was wealthy, he was a lord, he was attractive, he was a great poet, a celebrated poet. He was enormously wealthy. So he drew unprecedented attention. Well, he married a woman, Lady Byron, who was a mathematician. So Lord Byron is this poet of intense literary sensibilities, married to a more sober, logician mathematician. This would be important in the life of their daughter. Byron abandoned the family when Ada was like 4 months old, so he was not involved in her upbringing. Her mother was bitter over that. Byron was very idiosyncratic, very impulsive. That's part of the romantic sort of image, the romantic sort of impulse and sensibility. Ada's mother wanted something different for her daughter. So she kind of encouraged her to move in the direction of mathematics and logic, following the example of her mother. Now, it turns out that Ada had mathematical ability, conspicuous mathematical ability that showed itself early on. Because she's from an aristocratic family, a wealthy family, a famous family, she had access. She drew the attention of famous mathematicians, Augustus de Morgan, Charles Babbage. So she had people that would mentor her. She had opportunities to develop her talents at a very high level because she was moving through a world of privilege, right? Of wealth and privilege. Nevertheless, she had the ability, and she impressed everyone, every mathematician that she encountered with her ability. Now, one of the people that she came across, Charles Babbage, was the inventor of what's called the Analytical Engine. It's considered the first operating computer, but a computer that was capable of doing calculations. Ada became fascinated by the device, studied it, and most significantly wrote what's considered the first computer program for this analytical engine. The program, and I'll show you a picture of it. Oh, and by the way, here again, this image of Ada shows you, this is a woman of wealth, of aristocratic standing. And again, that was important. When I talk about convergence theory, right, I talk about the factors that make a result possible, that contribute to a result. Her wealth, her rank, her privilege, in addition to her ability, allowed that ability to flourish. Here, well, it's hard to see, but just, I don't think you can see it at all, but there it is. Okay, it exists. It's actually a program to develop the series of Bernoulli numbers. These were numbers that arise from series that were developed in calculus. Calculus had been created by Newton and Leibniz independently of each other over a century earlier. And so the 18th century was focused on elaborating a lot of the results that Newton and Leibniz set the groundwork for. Ada, in her kind of focus on Bernoulli numbers, was working a little bit in that tradition. But her work was respectable. It was admired. She was admired, by the people in her circle. And again, she is honored historically, in the computer language that's named for her. Let me see if there's something that I meant to say that I haven't said about her. A couple of other things, I guess. she saw herself as a poetical scientist, somebody that merged like a sensibility for literature, for the word, with the precision of number. But beyond that, she had a vision of the computer as being able to manipulate things other than just numbers. So her vision of the computer actually comports with what the computer has become in contemporary life, not just an abacus, not just a device for doing arithmetic, but a device that can be used to solve problems in virtually any direction. That is a vision that, so far as we know, Ada Lovelace, her name is Lovelace because she married a lord, and again, she moved in highly aristocratic circles, and that provided access to people that could help her develop the kinds of mathematical talents that she manifested. Okay. A lot of these women are women whose families had wealth or rank, and that wealth, that rank provided access that most women did not have throughout the centuries, even up to recent times. The next major figure I wanted to mention, Marie Curie, is someone who did not come, well, she came from a family that at one time had money, but had lost it. But nevertheless, an educated family. Marie Curie was born in 1867, died in the near the first half of the 20th century. She was Polish. Her father was a teacher of physics and mathematics. So there you see, she had access to those subjects. He also ran some gymnasia, that's what they were called there and then. We call them high schools, effectively. At some point in Poland, the gymnasia that her father ran were no longer permitted by the Russian government that was in control at the time to teach laboratory science. So there was laboratory equipment at these high schools that the father took home, and they became a source of learning, of an introduction to experimental science for Marie Curie. She was largely self-taught early on, but also had exposure. Again, her father was, an educated man, a teacher and educator. She had exposure in Warsaw to a laboratory that she worked at, where she studied, that was run by an assistant of the great Russian chemist Mendeleev. So you see, there's mentorship and there's exposure that allows for the development of otherwise extraordinary gifts that might not be fully developed. Marie Curie had a sister who studied medicine. She went off to Paris. She had connections in Paris from her studies that Marie Curie was to take advantage of. At some point, Marie Curie moved to Paris. She began taking courses in physics and chemistry at the University of Paris. She met Pierre, her husband, Pierre Curie, who was also a scientist, a physicist. So again, that further expanded her opportunities, her range of contacts. In the course of her work, she was working in physics at a time when radioactivity had just been discovered. X-rays had just been discovered by Röntgen. Becquerel, another scientist, another physicist, was exploring uranium as a source of X-rays. The Curies, Marie and Pierre, worked on the nature of that radiation, the nature of radioactive decay. Marie Curie actually coined the word radioactivity. For her investigations into radioactivity with her husband and with Becquerel, the three were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903. She was the first woman to receive part of a Nobel Prize. She went on, her husband died in a tragic accident in Paris. She went on to isolate the elements, the radioactive elements, polonium, that she named after her native Poland, and radium. For her work on polonium and radium, she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1911. Now, she's the only woman to receive 2 Nobel Prizes, but there's only one man that's received 2 Nobel Prizes, and that's Linus Pauling, and that's for work in chemistry and peace. Marie Curie is the only human being to receive 2 Nobel Prizes in the sciences. So we're talking about an extraordinary level of accomplishment that can stand beside that of any man, right, working in those fields. She went on to apply like some of her discoveries in radiation, the effects of radiation, to work in cancer. She noticed that cancers were preferentially dying. They were more susceptible to the effects of radiation than healthy tissue. And so through her, radiation became a major means of treatment of cancer. So her work in radiation became fundamental to the subsequent development of physics. It became fundamental to the work that Rutherford did in exploring the nature of the atom. And so it's, again, not minor work off to one side that displays that a woman can do something in the sciences, but it's foundational work for what would come later in terms of the development of quantum mechanics. So we're dealing with a woman, again, who's one of the most celebrated in the history of science. I think it was 2009, there was a poll in New Scientist magazine where Marie Curie was celebrated as the single most inspirational woman in the history of science by a wide margin. She has been honored in almost every imaginable way, postage stamps and currency, has borne her name, her image. And she was a selfless researcher in many ways. She would give away Nobel Prize money. She was not interested in self-aggrandizement. Einstein said of her that she was probably the only person who could not be corrupted by fame. And she had an enormous amount of it. So again, there's an example at the highest level of scientific achievement. Mileva Maric is another name I want to say a little bit about. She was from a wealthy family. She was born in, I think, like 1876, around there, from a wealthy Serbian family. So her wealth, her father's standing gave her access to schools, private schools, where they might only allow boys, and it might be the only source of instruction in physics and in math, but she had access because of her family, because of her family's influence. So there is, again, privilege that's often needed, for accomplishments to be achieved, to be open to women, when avenues of opportunity are otherwise limited. In 1896, she left Serbia and was having health problems. So for her health, she went to Switzerland, and she enrolled at the Zurich Polytechnic Institute, 1896. What's important about that date and that location is that is where and when Einstein enrolled. Okay? So she became a classmate of Einstein, one of 6 and the only woman. The two developed apparently a friendship very quickly. Her abilities, and she was studying with Einstein at this Polytechnic Institute to become a teacher of physics and mathematics for secondary level students. Einstein was doing the same thing. They were following a course of instruction that involved, courses in integral and differential calculus, in projective and descriptive geometry, in theoretical physics, in experimental physics, in applied physics. Okay? I mean, it was a fairly rigorous level of instruction that they were receiving. Her performance in standardized tests that the school offered to evaluate competence in physics was at the same level as Einstein's performance. In mathematics, she did a little bit less well, but not that much. So this is obviously a woman of enormous natural ability, and ability that drew Einstein. In 1903, they married. They remained married until 1919, when they divorced. That was when Einstein received the Nobel Prize. What's important, though, about their relationship is that her level of understanding of physics and mathematics was considerable. And there's ongoing debate as to what degree she may have contributed to the development of Einstein's ideas on relativity theory. Now, we don't know for sure, and some people, there have been books written, emphasizing the contributions that she made, that the discussions that the two of them had, how they contributed to the development of the ideas that Einstein ultimately received the credit for. But she certainly could have contributed and likely did contribute. So again, we have an example of somebody who is placed at the center of one of the great achievements in the history of science, the way of a marriage. A fellow student of Einstein, when Einstein was developing his ideas, he published his initial papers on special theory of relativity in 1905. So that was 2 years into their marriage, and they had known each other almost a decade leading up to that. So that's plenty of opportunity for her to have been an influence upon his work. And she certainly was capable of it. Okay, I want to mention Rosalind Franklin in another field, another direction, this time in the biological sciences. Rosalind Franklin was also born into a wealthy family, a wealthy Jewish family, a banking family. So that, again, automatically gave her privileges that other women, not so fortunate, not so well placed, did not have. But Rosalind Franklin, born in, I think, 1920, okay, demonstrated high levels of academic ability, talent from a young age. She was graduating at the top of her class. So she was gifted intellectually and was fortunate in her circumstances. She was able to go to Cambridge University, where she studied physical chemistry. She got a PhD in physical chemistry. She became an X-ray crystallographer, one of the most accomplished X-ray crystallographers of her time, of the mid-20th century. Well, when she was at Cambridge, people were working on elucidating the structure of DNA. DNA is the molecule of life, right? DNA contains the blueprint of every organism. It is the key to understanding heredity. It is the key to understanding cellular molecular biology. It is the guiding, governing molecule. There's a dogma of molecular biology. DNA makes RNA, makes protein, and that basically summarizes life as we understand it. The effort to elucidate the structure of DNA was the main focus of work in biology at the mid-20th century. And the most important work was taking place at Cambridge. There was James Watson, an American biologist, Francis Crick, British, Wilkins. They were working together, they were working at the same time. Watson and Crick were working together. Watson and Crick were successful in determining the double helical structure of DNA that has become really ranks as one of the few supreme achievements in the history of biology, in the history of science. For their work, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins received the Nobel Prize in 1962 for physiology and medicine. Rosalind Franklin did not receive the Nobel Prize for that accomplishment, even though it was her work in X-ray crystallography that helped point to the helical structure of the molecule that was decisive in elucidating its actual full structure. There's a famous photograph, photo 51. Oh, some more pictures. Here's Marie Curie. I forgot to show you this. Mileva Maric, Einstein's wife. Rosalind Franklin. And, that means here's the photograph, the X-ray crystallographic image that helped determine that DNA had a helical structure. That was central to the work that Watson and Crick were doing. Rosalind Franklin has been seen as the dark lady of DNA, the person who was not recognized at the time for an achievement that should have placed her, at the level of Watson, Crick, and Wilkins. Her story has become celebrated now. She is recognized. She is honored, for her contribution. It is now well known. She also did important work in elucidating the structure of viruses, the tobacco mosaic virus, which actually has a lot in common with coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and poliovirus. So Again, we have a woman scientist placed at the center of not just a minor accomplishment that demonstrates that a woman can contribute to the sciences, but one of the seminal results in the history of her field, in the history of biology. Okay, I want to do a few more examples. I hope, and then I want to give you more of a philosophical perspective on what this all amounts to. I think I'll go a little bit faster. I think the point is being made that women have played a fundamental role at the highest levels in the development of the sciences. And so there's no reason to think that a woman cannot do something within the sciences at the highest possible level. We'll see a few more examples of that. The Chinese-American physicist, experimental physicist, Wu, Chien-Shung Wu, from the mid-20th century. Also, a product of a family of means. Her father was an engineer. Her father encouraged her in the sciences. He would not read normal bedtime stories to her, but read from research journals in the sciences. So she was exposed at a young age, to science at a sophisticated level. She was an outstanding student, so she demonstrated her intellectual abilities at a very young age. That drew support, that drew the attention, of mentors. She took classes at University of Shanghai. She soon came to the United States and went to Berkeley. At Berkeley, she became known to Oppenheimer, who would become the head of the Manhattan Project. She also became known to Louis Alvarez, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, subsequently, who considered Wu to be the most talented experimental physicist he had ever met. So Wu was a woman of extraordinary capabilities. Let me show you a picture. You can see against the background of some of her work. I don't know how well this will show up, but there is Wu. Now, Wu worked on the Manhattan Project, developed the atomic bomb. She was involved in separating the isotopes of uranium that was an essential process in order to achieve a fissionable amount of material that could support an explosion. It was like one of the main preoccupations of the project to achieve isolation of this particular isotope, rare isotope of uranium, uranium-235. But Wu is even more renowned for what's called the Wu experiment. Wu was an expert on beta decay, a type of radioactive decay. Go back to Marie Curie's work. Beta decay is a type of decay process where the nucleus gives off, as it's decaying, electrons, beta particles. There were two theoretical physicists, Chinese theoretical physicists, Li and Yang, who were investigating beta decay, and they saw in beta decay the possibility of revolutionizing physics. There is something called the law of parity, or conservation of parity in physics. It basically relates to the fact that the universe is symmetrical, that at the atomic level, you can't really distinguish processes going left from processes going right. That the right hand or the left hand of the universe were not distinguishable as such. The universe was fundamentally symmetric at a basic level. It's called conservation parity. That idea of that symmetry. Well, it was a fundamental sense of the world, a fundamental understanding of the nature of the world, that it was symmetrical in that way at that level. Li and Yang saw in some experimental results relating to beta decay that it might not be so. And they went to Wu to see if she could design an experiment that would determine whether the universe was symmetric at a subatomic level or not, whether parity was conserved or not. A fundamental issue in physics, one of the fundamental issues. Wu designed the experiment. It was carried out. It revealed that parity was not conserved, that the universe was not symmetric at that subatomic level, as had been believed. Now, I've made a major issue of the asymmetry of our world, and ultimately one can link it to circumstances at the subatomic level. So again, this is not a trivial result. This is a profound result that became central to the development of our contemporary understanding of particle physics. Li and Yang received the Nobel Prize for their work in 1957. Wu was not so honored, but she was subsequently honored with other major awards in physics, and stands as one of the great figures in the history of experimental science, in the history of experimental physics, and again was involved not in a minor result, but a major contribution to our understanding of nature of the world. A few more examples. I'm not going on 2 minutes long with these examples, but I think it's important. There was a film made a few years ago called Hidden Figures. It was about 3 female Black African-American mathematicians that I'll show you. Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, all born in the first quarter of the 20th century. They all displayed mathematical ability from a young age. They all excelled, valedictorians in the top of their class. They were obviously in a society, growing up in a society that was prejudiced against Blacks, prejudiced against women is historically, right? We've seen opportunities for women more limited than for men. But they were able to rise, partly because of their demonstration early on of extraordinary ability, also because they had the advantage of being able to go to Black institutions, Black colleges that were not prejudiced against them, that invited them in, and there they were able to be exposed to mentors, professors, Black professors, but distinguished mathematicians, men in the sciences that were able to guide and inspire and support the development of these women. They became central to orbital work at, the predecessor to NASA and then NASA. When John Glenn went into space, became the first American to orbit the Earth. Computers were in use at NASA by that time, but Glenn would not go into orbit until these women had checked the calculations and had verified that the orbital trajectories that were being contemplated were valid. So these were women who, now, one thing, and it's an important point to make about this, we're dealing with prejudice, right, against women, against blacks, but we're also dealing with a field, mathematics, where results are relatively, reasonably incontrovertible, right? If one can come up with a strong mathematical proof, a strong mathematical result, then you have to accept it. So that's one of the advantages, one of the reasons why these women were able to rise, to levels of success, as women, as Black women, because they were doing mathematics. And so the value and the power of their results were unassailable. They had to be recognized, and they were. These women have been subsequently. So again, we see women involved in one of the major enterprises of the 20th century, the American space program. A couple more women. Tu Youyou is a Chinese scientist, a Chinese biologist, pharmaceutical researcher that discovered artemisinin. It is the first effective drug treatment of malaria. For that, she received the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in, I think it was 2015. She is the only Chinese to receive, male or female, the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine. So again, achievement at the highest level. Now, she was working within the communist society there, a more egalitarian system, honestly, at the time, where if you demonstrated, excellence, that would be embraced, and it was in her case. And finally, I want to mention two women, Jennifer Doudna, an American working at University of California at Berkeley, and Emmanuelle Charpentier, who was also at Berkeley, but later at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. They were responsible in 2012 or so, 2011, 2012, for adapting CRISPR, a bacterial defense mechanism that bacteria would use to defend themselves against viral infections, for adapting that defense system in bacteria for use as a gene cutting, a gene splicing, a gene manipulation technology. Probably ranks with the discovery of the structure of DNA as one of the most significant achievements in the history of biology, in the history of the subject. They received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020 for that work. It has revolutionized biology, contemporary biology, and will continue to revolutionize it because its applications are as broad as one's imagination in terms of how it might be used to edit genes to help cure diseases. So again, we're talking about women at the highest level of scientific achievement. Okay, now, I've mentioned that these are examples that can serve as encouragements, right? From a heuristic standpoint. If they can do it and they're women, then these women over here can be capable intrinsically as well. Okay, but again, even if these women did not exist or did not contribute at such levels, if no woman had ever contributed at such a level, doesn't matter. Doesn't mean that the next woman cannot. That's the nature of our existential space. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. Rigor decides, establishes that each point is unique. And so each point is a unique convergence. Heuristically, we cannot know in advance what someone might be capable of. We also cannot know in advance that they are not capable of any given result. So philosophically, we are freed, from any constraints that we think the past imposes upon us. Because something has not been done does not rigorously argue for its impossibility moving forward. That's at every level. And that's at the level of gender, at the level of the achievement of any given individual. And it's also at the level of achievement of an individual in his or her lifetime. If a given woman has not manifested certain abilities or hasn't made certain contributions yet, that doesn't mean that tomorrow or the day after, inspired by some example like I've talked about today, inspired by some example from this talk or any one of those individuals, might not be so inspired that her effort is then directed towards results that will ultimately flourish. We don't know in advance. We hear religiously, the truth shall set you free. Well, the truth that genuinely, rigorously sets us free is the truth of philosophical rigor. That whatever distinguishes one individual, one point from another, means that what applies to one does not rigorously apply to the other, including any type of limitation. We suffocate under premature senses of reality. Philosophy, rigor, lets us breathe again, opens up the whole realm of possibility. We have time, good. There's a section in Joshua, the books of Joshua at the end, that deals with the nature of identity, issues of identity. I'll recite it, quickly. It deals with, again, this notion of the past being a prison and philosophy the way out, rigor the way out. A rose is a rose, as everyone knows, but what deeper truths do tautologies disclose? With Cordelia dead, and through tears that burn, Lear will discern, as best he can, that a man is a man. And this will have taken a lifetime to learn. But we have not yet seen how tautologies mean. Let's study an ocean in slow motion. A man is what? Tall, strong, a warrior, an heir, here, near, over there. As Eckhart's daughter, we can only stare and answer a man against expectation of predication, common or rare. It means as humor, thwarting what we expect, denying our sense of what must come next. And knowledge is a demonstration of just such expectation. And its walls confine as prevarication. But rigor demurs, finding reason to doubt what we think must come about, as the past is a prison and this the way out. We wallpaper the future with prints from the past and marvel that pain can last and last, as if guesswork were gain and rigor too plain, as if two things could ever be the same. But that they cannot is what we forgot in journeying far from Eden. So there's a statement of the degree to which philosophy rigor liberates us from any sense of limitation that the past imposes, even in our sense of limitations that we might ascribe to gender, which obviously my examples contradict. The ultimate freedom that philosophy provides is a freedom from conceptualizations at all, freedom from concepts at all, which are inherently limiting. Epistemic space is an aconceptual space. When we talk about the concept of God, remember I've said that St. Augustine said of God, we can say nothing. Well, there is a silence of God because God represents an aconceptual space. The concepts vanish where all things become one thing. The concepts don't form in a radically distinct, divergent space. Now, there's a statement of that that again is a path to freedom. Freedom from any constraints that we think gender imposes, right? And it's given, and this is in the title of the talk, in a sermon, in a legend, it's called, by Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart was a medieval mystic Christian writer of enormous influence, someone that I have enormous respect for. This little story that I will close with, okay? It's very short, but I'm going to read it because it gives the power of an aconceptualizing approach to experience where whatever we think a given concept implies does not apply rigorously to us, to any given individual, man or woman, non-binary, whatever the case may be. So here is, let me show you the picture of Wu. Here is, this is 2UU, who discovered the malarial treatment and won the Nobel Prize for that. And here is Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. So let me read you. It's called Meister Eckhart's Daughter. And let me just pull it up here. Oops. And let me find my glasses. Okay. Oops, let me go back. Okay, here it is. And remember, this was written in the middle, like the 14th century. A young girl came to a Dominican convent and asked for Meister Eckhart. The porter said, "Whom shall I announce?" She replied, "I don't know." He said, "Why don't you know?" She said, "Because I am neither a girl, nor a woman, nor husband, nor wife, nor widow, nor virgin, nor master, nor maid, nor manservant." The porter went to Meister Eckhart. "Come out to the strangest creature I ever saw, and let me go with you. And put your head out and ask, 'Who wants me?'" He did so. She spoke to him the same as she had spoken to the porter. He said, "My dear child, you speak truthfully and with a ready tongue. Explain to me more fully what you mean." She said, "If I were a girl, I would still be in my primal innocence. If I were a woman, I would be bearing the eternal word without cease in my soul. If I were a man, I should put up a stiff resistance to all sins. If I were a wife, I should be faithful to my soul and beloved husband. If I were a widow, I should ever yearn for my one and only love. If I were a virgin, I should be in reverent service. If I were a master, I would command all the divine virtues. If I were a maid, I should be meekly subject to God and all creatures. If I were a manservant, I should be hard at work serving my Lord with my whole will and without contradiction. But I am none of all these things. I am just a something among somethings. And so I go." The master went and said to his brothers, "It seems to me that I have just heard the purest person I have ever met." It's a matter of being in a rigorous space, in the reality of our circumstances beyond all categories. And if we are beyond all categories, we're beyond all limitations that categories impose. Okay, so that will conclude tonight's talk. Again, in recognition of International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And I hope this will serve as an inspiration to any women that are listening, that there are no limitations, no matter what the historical precedent might be. And the same thing applies to men in every direction. Okay, it applies to all of us. It's the nature of our existential circumstance and the nature of our dignity. Okay, now I want to look at some of the questions from last time. We have a little bit more time than we often have at the end, so this is good. Okay, first question. I talked about language last time. How would you connect learning foreign languages with philosophy and people's minds? Okay, this is a very big topic, actually. And here's a point. I actually have an aphorism that relates to this. The multiplicity of language explicates mind, explains the nature of mind. And what I mean by that is, if you look at human beings, let's say, as we understand them today in terms of their complexity, their molecular complexity, you might think that it's so complex. A human being is such a complex organism that if we assembled a human being, like from scratch, the demands of that complex organization might be such that we'd be able to achieve one such human being because of how complex that individual, that phenomenon is. No, we have billions of human beings. We have billions of lots of things whose complexity would suggest, my goodness, if we were designing this in a laboratory, we might be lucky to achieve one. Similarly with language. We might think that language is so complex, any given language, that the human mind would be able to engineer one such language, not thousands. The fact that it does, the fact that we exist in multiplicities, the fact that languages exist in such multiplicities tells us something very deep about the nature of heuristic space, because it's heuristic space that is allowing multiple possibilities and multiple approaches that we place under a given concept. So it's a deep idea that multiplicity of language explicates mind. Now, okay. And obviously when we're in foreign languages, we're exploring those multiplicities that we might think not possible, but in fact exist. Number 2, what is the importance of great philosophers in influencing the language learning process? Okay, the philosopher who's had the most important impact upon that is Wittgenstein, as I was talking about last time. And that influences that the learning of a first language is a fundamental different type of process than the learning of a second language. A first language is learned through exposure to a culture, exposure to a way of life, a form of life. That's why really in learning any language, you immerse yourself in the culture. It's a matter of being trained in the way of life. It's not enough to learn just an abstract set of words or rules of grammar. One has to see how they connect to how they are embedded in the human experience, the culture that they made possible. The other aspect is convergence theory. If you want to achieve a result, you achieve it by means of a series of convergences. Those convergences can be in terms of an effort that's repeated. It can be in terms of different types of efforts. So I recommend that when one is learning a language, one does as much as possible. That's true for any goal that one wants to achieve. The more repetition, the more times, the more different things one does, reading things, listening to things, watching things, conversing, writing, memorizing, all different avenues of a means of experiencing the language are helpful in achieving a given goal, because any goal is achieved convergently. And the third question, what is the perspective of today and tomorrow in education and learning foreign languages? Okay, it goes in two directions, I think. On the one hand, there's been an impulse throughout much of human history towards a universal language, right? People are discouraged when they see how many languages there are, because no matter how many languages one learns, one's not going to learn thousands, right, in a lifetime. So in the Middle Ages, it was Latin that was a universal language. In the 16th century, Spanish, because of the influence of the Spanish Empire. In the 17th century, French became the diplomatic language, the universal language. Since the rise of Britain and the continued, influence of countries like America, right, English-speaking countries, it's been English, right? If China, sort of achieves even greater influence, hegemony, economic power, it might be Mandarin Chinese, in decades or a century from now. But the point is, there has been an aspiration towards a single unifying language. At the moment, again, that's predominantly English, right? That's the language that is most studied as a second language. On the other hand, there's also the recognition that languages and results in languages at the highest level don't translate, right? When I was young, I was interested in ideas more than the aesthetics of the language. And so I read a lot of things in translation. But once I discovered Shakespeare, suddenly I was mostly interested in things I could read in the original, because I was aware of how much I was missing if I wasn't doing that. So on the one hand, we still have this impulse towards universality of communication, that the modern world and the degree to which people are linked by computers, linked by communication, means that we are communicating much more across the globe. And so having a single means of communication, a single language, a single medium is effective. On the other hand, developing technologies like Google Translate, is making it possible for people to preserve, their language and still have a facility to communicate to people who don't have that linguistic reference, or that, can't communicate in their native tongue. So I think so there's a recognition of the value, of what's been created, preserved in each language. On the other hand, there's still an impulse towards universality of communication, but maybe technology will overcome that in terms of the facility of technology to effect translations, rapid translations, immediate translations. Okay, I think it looks like our time is up, so that will conclude today's talk.
So yeah, Stephen, thank you very much for holding these talks every week, dedicating the topics and all the summary. We truly appreciate it all. Thank you very much for being our speaker every week. And thank you, the audience, for all your likes. We truly see that. Greetings, Navidula. Thank you for your greetings. Hello. Hello. And then Sophia is a very active participant of our events as well. I have seen the Hidden Figures film recently. It was very interesting. I'm glad that Theodore Melfi made this film.
Mhm.
So thank you very much for your comments and all of your questions. We will definitely address them next week. Please make sure to join us next Friday. And one more time, Stephen, thank you very much for being with us. Stay safe and have a great week, everyone.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
everybody, for joining us. See you next time. Thank you. And thank you, Alita.